No one has anything? Okay. And now that takes us to our student representative update. Kennedy.
Good evening, board reps. I just have a short update for tonight. So to start off, Kaufman Band has a concert tomorrow night at 7 p.m., and their Celebration of Excellence event will be held on February 27th. For Jerome, they hosted a Black History Month celebration on February 20th during lunch, where there was a fashion show and amazing food to celebrate. And Jerome Theater is putting on their production of Little Shop of Horrors this weekend. Along with that, Jerome Cheer won states this past weekend. At Scioto, their theater had their production of Hadestown, the musical, this past weekend, and Scioto also had a pep rally on Friday trying to raise awareness for the upcoming Dublin-thon, which raises money for pediatric cancer. And the Scioto band won $20,000 in the Metallic Band competition, placing second in their division and first in the fan vote. And finally, their cheer team placed as state runner-ups as the state championships this past weekend. And that is all I have for you guys.
Thank you, Kennedy. We will move on now to reports and action items from the superintendent's office. Dr. Marshausen.
All right. Special thanks to Mr. Stark. First of all, he went to a P&Z meeting and I didn't have to. And as a result of Mr. Stark going to the Planning and Zoning Committee meeting, the Scioto addition was approved by Planning and Zoning with a couple contingencies, but thanks to Mr. Stark and our partners at Fanning and Howie for having a great presentation for P&Z. And after answering some of their questions, getting that approval. We also want to thank our partners at Washington Township Fire and Rescue. In my meeting today with City Manager O'Callahan, we talked about our partnership with the fire department and their goals when it comes to being able to access the whole site and having emergency roads and all of those conversations. So we're grateful for that township partnership. And then we are finalizing stormwater plans in the next 2 weeks. That's our final hurdle. And then once those stormwater plans are in place, we should be able to get permits. And you should start seeing equipment show up at Scioto within the next month or two so that we will be ready to rock and roll. Our second board meeting in May will be at Scioto, as we will have our formal groundbreaking there at Scioto, likely in the cafeteria. And it'll be fun to point out which walls we're going to knock out, glass we're going to walk out as we enlarge the cafeteria there and have those conversations. So, Jeff, job well done. Thank you very much. Focus on Dublin families. I think I may have gotten to all of this in our public comment section. We are implementing tomorrow Senate Bill 104, which is the bathroom bill. I am grateful to Mr. Andrus and Mr. Wolf and our counselors for engaging with every student and family when it comes to any changes that we have to make, and our principals and counselors for doing what needs to be done to make changes that bring us in compliance with Senate Bill 104. As we talked about, we're planning for the Parents' Bill of Rights. We'll have those first readings for the policy coming up. We've talked about the Dear Colleague letter and what that means. And even before we talk today, our commitment to our students with disabilities and 504s is unwavering as we implement changes that are coming our way. But again, continue to be focused on the students in our Dublin classrooms and the work that our amazing teachers do. And then finally, advocacy for school funding and Dublin students. As I mentioned, Mrs. Rigby and I are meeting with Education Chair Andy Brenner this week. We'll show him around Emerald Campus. I spoke to Senator Reineke today to advocate for the 10% minimum of state funding. We also are very active with the Alliance for High Quality Education. Their lobbyist is a Dublin resident who I talk to on a weekly basis, has students in the Dublin City District. So when we look at the conversations that we're able to have, we're able to keep those really in Dublin focused in what is possible when looking at the governor's proposed budget and where that budget's going to land, probably sometime, hopefully by the end of June, which is why by when they have to have it passed. We also have a close working relationship with ODU and Director Dakin. Mr. Andrus has become a go-to for some of the folks in their department when it comes to the services that we provide. Mrs. Marple and her team work closely with them when it comes to our pathways work. We've had Director Dakin and his staff here multiple times to talk about and see what we're doing in Dublin, because when we talk about being a model when it comes to a lot of this work, we are. And we're proud to be a model, and having those relationships and being able to work with the department is critical in what we do moving forward. Any questions from the board on where we are right now? And
Do you want to say what the Dear Colleague letter was and how it relates to DEI and how it's not the same as an executive order?
well, it's kind of hard right now because we're not sure what the administration's response is going to be to anything. The Dear Colleague letter called for an end to all DEI activities in K-12 and public universities and colleges across the country by Friday. As I said, we do not have any specific activities that I believe would put the Dublin City Schools at risk. What the administration does on Friday afternoon, Saturday, or Sunday would be, I can't speculate to what's going to happen. What I can say is that the Dear Colleague letter is not a law. And as I've said in these meetings before to some of the folks who spoke tonight, most of the time when you get an executive order or you get a letter like we saw, we would be waiting for the U.S. Department of Education to take that document, determine what it is, and then issue guidance to state departments of education. And then that would get to the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce, and then we would wait for the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce to spin off and tell us what that means for us in our public schools. So, Mrs. Messick, the pace at which this administration is working right now and their implementation methods are different than what we've experienced in the past. So it is very different than what we would have seen in the past in terms of the speed at which I think many of us who are in these positions, the duty to respond and the obligation to protect your institution versus the typical way we would see things come to us in terms of guidance. So Mrs. Philemon just walked in. We rely on legal counsel frequently, and we, unfortunately, it's a day-to-day journey.
Okay, Dr. Schwanke, I didn't know if you wanted to make any brief statement on the policy for first read tonight.
Absolutely. We, as Dr. Marshausen referenced earlier, we have a policy committee that about twice a year responds to Neola's recommendations with a committee with Mrs. Philemon, Mrs. De Silva, and Mrs. Rigby. Those come in a big clump, and we work through them and approve them. This is a standalone for a couple of reasons. Policy 5113.01 was cumbersome and long and confusing to our families. So we have significantly simplified it, and we plan to shift the details of that into administrative guidelines. Why are we doing it as a one-off? Because a different board policy says that the first board meeting in March, we need to come to you with our capacity resolution, which shows how many students we can have in each school based on square footage capacity divided by the students that are projected to attend that school. So in order to get ahead of the March meeting, we had to put this policy in front of you for a first read. So at the next meeting, we will vote on this policy plus the capacity resolution that will determine what schools are open for interdistrict enrollment. So that's a lot. Any questions about that? We're putting the horse before the cart. That's what we're doing here.
Thank you. And again, because it's a first read, there is no board action on that tonight. So we are moving on to reports and action items from the Treasurer's Office. Mr. Curran.
Yes, real quick to piggyback on Dr. Marshausen and the budget process. We're just really in the beginning of it. The governor's proposal is starting to get hearings and stuff like that. And so it goes through the process, and then the House makes the tweaks that they want to put in there and maybe have their own formula funding plan. It just depends. Then it goes to the Senate, which has their own idea typically, and then they come back together and reconcile and try to get everything done prior to June 30th, which is they need to have new budgets starting the new fiscal year of July 1. And oftentimes it comes down to that very last day, or even line item vetoes by the governor at midnight, or around that time. But it's just, we're on top of it. We'll continue to watch it. One thing we always, which is scary sometimes, is that reconciliation phase between the Senate and the House. Is stuff getting added last minute or deleted last minute into. So, but like Dr. Marshausen mentioned, our associations cover us, from Ohio school business officials, from superintendents and school board associations, are really on top of all this and kind of take the lead from a statewide perspective as we then look to our local representatives. So just kind of wanted to go over that process, just a reminder that where we're at with that. On this evening's agenda, real quick, we have one donation. We have the resolutions to file a complaint against real property. This is a new state measure in the last couple years. We do for just commercial property, not residential property. We do have property tax challenges that we'll look from Board of Revision and Board of Tax Appeals. This allows us to do that, but we have to we have to approve these and then mail out to the individual owners, which will be handled by our attorneys at Rich and Gillis. Just a reminder why we do this. Yes, do we protect our property tax base, which is 85% of what we do, but also in the standpoint it's protected for the taxpayers, because if someone's property is valued too low with state equalization of rates and levy amounts, that someone else is paying too high. So you want stuff to be accurately and fairly valued when it comes to taxation. And so, yes, we are protecting our tax base in that sense, but we're also, it is protection of the taxpayers, as you don't want some people paying too little and some paying too much. You kind of want that, of course, land in the middle and pay their fair share. And then finally, we have our approval of our January financial report. As you can see, we talk about how close we are. We're on point at this point in the year with our estimates compared to our actuals in the general fund, which is our operating fund. We will be hopefully be getting, as I talked about a couple times, 85% of what our revenue is from property taxes. Hopefully in March here, we'll start to see the final settlements from Franklin, Delaware, and Union counties, and to kind of see where our estimates land for the year as they complete the first half of real estate taxes being paid. And that all works into, as we get to, along with the state budget, along with expenditures and budget and planning and so forth, and responsible staffing plan as we go into May, and our update of our 5-year forecast. So, any questions?
There being no questions, it is recommended by the treasurer that the board approve items 5B through 5E. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Valentine. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. Messick. Questions or comments? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Valentine?
Yes.
Mrs. Messig?
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva?
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis?
Yes.
And Mrs. Rigby?
Yes. Motion passes 5-0. Reports from the Department of Academics and Student Learning. Dr. Schwanke.
No reports this evening. Thank
Okay,
you.
Great. That brings us to reports from the Department of Operations. Mr. Stark.
Good evening. We have a couple items for your consideration tonight. The first one is, we have 3. One is payment in lieu. As you know, we just bring these as they come. We don't do them every year, just as they come on board. So these were compiled by our Transportation Department. The next item is also our Transportation Department. For students who have special needs or special difficulties, we provide individual transportation. We had 3 providers. It's very difficult sometimes to even get the first 2. It's a challenging business. And the 3rd provider we had could no longer support our insurance requirements. So we found a new provider, Buckeye's Best Transport, and this is their agreement that was reviewed by our legal counsel. And this will be our 3rd transportation one. Lastly is the approval for an owner's representative. This will be our 3rd and our last owner's representative to handle what we have is close to 3 dozen projects over the next 2 years, and we have a lot of projects. And what this basically does is gives us some temporary staff of some really smart people. We already have a certified architect, we have a construction manager, and this person we're recommending tonight from Elford is a certified engineer. And her project will be not only some of our bond projects, but will also help us along with the Scioto addition. There are a number of details with every one of these projects, a number of meetings, and numbers of city's officials you need to go to. And the nice thing about this is we get some very qualified staff, and when the project is done, they leave the district. So it's not a long-term cost. It's a cost that I work with Brian and Tyson on, Mr. Kern and Mr. Hodges on incorporating in the overall project cost. So this comes right out of the bond money, and it will help us achieve our goals of on time and on schedule. If there's any questions.
I just have one question. Just in light of the conversation tonight with money and for the owner's representative, in your experience in these projects, when we have multiple projects, what is a cost savings estimate you would think that somebody like an owner's representative would bring? I mean, I realize we're paying that representative, but what's the trade-off?
That's a hard one. I will tell you the trade-off is one in time. It helps us get things done on time. And the trade-off there is, for example, if a school doesn't open on time, that's a very hard price to put on. And as far as money, I truly believe they pay for themselves, because when you're working with with contractors, and there's pay apps to go and mistakes that can easily be made, and not all the mistakes are nefarious mistakes. Sometimes they're just mistakes, but someone needs to be there to catch those mistakes. And also, as they bring back ideas, because obviously we meet with these owners reps continually, and as they bring back things, we're able to get more visibility so we can come up with ideas collectively as a team to what if we go route A and B instead of C and D, and that will help us. So I would say that this is very much easily pays for itself, because again, without it, we'd be juggling and a lot of things would be dropping, if that helps answer the question.
It is recommended by the superintendent that the board approve items 8A through 8C. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. De Silva. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. Gillis. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. De Silva,
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis,
Yes.
Mr. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Messick,
Yes.
and Mrs. Rigby.
Yes. Motion passes 5-0. Reports from the Department of Human Resources. Mr. Boney.
Good evening, members of the board. We have 2 sections tonight. The first is our certified agenda, and I'll just cover a few items in that section. The first one is an administrative hire that you'll find. Kim Jude, she's going to join Mr. Andres' team as a coordinator of student services. She's coming to us from Marysville City Schools, where she's currently the director of student services, and she's replacing Lenore Saragini, who's retiring from Dublin this summer. You'll see 2 certified resignations along with 1 retirement. Andrea Williams is retiring from Carr Middle School, and she's been with us for 30 years. There's 1 6-period pay request. It's on for your approval due to a staff transfer a few weeks back, and that's why it's a little bit later than normal. And then the next items are related to summer work for our staff, and these individuals work in our student support services area and will provide summer assessment for our students. And then the supplementals that you see on tonight are just for spring and fall athletics. And then moving on to our classified agenda, you'll see 1 resignation and 3 retirements. And the retirements are for Lynn Hokeson, who retired as a parapro from Wright Elementary. She's been here for 10 years. Bonnie Justice is retiring from our transportation department with 12 years. And then Judith Westney will retire as a cook cashier from Indian Run, and she's been with us for 27 years. The final items are 3 new hires and then 1 unpaid leave of absence in this section. And tonight, the HR department does not have any stipends on for your approval.
Okay, it is recommended by the superintendent that the board approve items 10A and 10B. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Valentine, second.
Second.
Second by Mrs. Messick. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Messick,
Yes.
Mrs. De Silva,
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis,
Yes.
and Mrs. Rigby.
Yes, motion passes 5-0. Future agenda items. Anybody have anything? Okay. There being none, we are going to move into executive session in accordance with Ohio Revised Code 121.22G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The Board of Education will go into executive session to consider the employment of a public employee or official. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. De Silva. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mrs. Gillis. Any questions or comments from the board? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. De Silva,
Yes.
Mrs. Gillis,
Yes.
Mr. Valentine,
Yes.
Mrs. Messick,
Yes.
and Mrs. Rigby.
Yes. Motion passes 5-0. And there will be no action coming out of executive session.